Hey guys, today we're going to discuss two stories about skinwalkers I found on the internet. Give us a like and let's go. My name is Nate Walker. I don't like to tell this story because every time I remember those events, something inside shrinks. It happened in the fall of 2013 in northern Arizona near the Utah border. I was working as a ranger in the Kaibab National Forest, the part of the forest closer to the Navajo Indian Reservation. This place, it always seemed strange to me. Even the old guides who knew the forest inside and out were reluctant to go there. They called it the Wolf Trail. When I asked why, they just shook their heads. That day it started out pretty ordinary. I was on patrol with my dog Roy, a large black and white dog, a mestizo of Siberian husky and sheepdog. He was always with me on shift, and in his spare time, he lived with me in a cabin near the woods. It was late fall, the air was cold and dry leaves rustled under my boots. Roy and I walked a few miles along the forest trail, checking for hunting camps. At one point he suddenly froze and growled quietly, looking into the thicket. "What's out there, boy?" I asked. Roy didn't answer. Of course he didn't. But the fur on his scruff stood up. He growled louder. I looked that way. There was something among the trees. At first I thought it was a wolf, but something about it wasn't right. Its paws were too long, its neck was too stretched out, its eyes were big but didn't reflect light like a normal animal. I took a step to the side and blinked. The creature was gone. The swarm howled, low, pitifully. I can't say I was frightened. I've worked these woods long enough to be used to the weirdness, but there was a twinge inside. I decided not to linger in this place and continued on my way. Roy was walking beside me, but he was behaving differently now, moving a little forward as if he wanted to check out the path in front of me. The farther we got from that place, the calmer he became. I decided not to dwell on it and continued my work. But the next day it got worse. That night I could not sleep for a long time. Something about the creature I saw in the forest kept me awake. It was no ordinary animal, but people don't move like that either. Roy lay on the doorstep, guarding the house as always. Sometimes he stirred and squeaked in his sleep. I could hear the night wind outside the window, the creaking of the old trees. Everything was as usual. But around 3 in the morning, I was awakened by a sound, a scraping sound, somewhere near the front door. I sat up in bed, straining my hearing. Roy was no longer asleep. He was sitting on the doorstep, tense, wary. The fur on his scruff of his neck was tousled. The scraping sound was repeated. Like someone scratching at the door, slowly as if trying to see if it could be opened. I held my breath. Roy growled softly, but he didn't rush to the door. He just sat there and watched. I realized, whatever was outside, he didn't want me to go in there. I didn't want to either. I reached for the flashlight, but before I turned it on, I decided to look out the window. Very slowly, so as not to attract attention. I stood up and walked over to the glass. It was dark outside, the forest. Only a black silhouettes of trees. The yard, empty. But here's the strange thing. Roy wasn't looking at the door. He was looking a little to the side, like someone was there, around the corner of the house. I heard the sound again. No, it wasn't coming from the door, but from the wall right under the window. And that's when Roy growled. But not the usual growl. It wasn't a threatening growl, but something else. A low warning growl. I took a step back. Quiet. Too quiet. I couldn't hear the wind or the rustles or even Roy's breathing. And then something very fast skipped in front of the window. A black shadow. Long, unnaturally extended limbs. I couldn't see the face, but I felt it was looking right at me. And that's when Roy howled. Not the usual howl. It was like a scream, like a warning. I drew back and grabbed the gun, but when I looked out the window again, there was no one there. Just night, and the quiet creaking of branches in the wind. I woke up to a sound. In the darkness, I didn't realize at first what had woken me up. The wind, the creaking of old boards, or maybe just my own restless sleep. But no, there was that sound again, scraping. At first I thought it was wood scraping against the wall of the house. But then I realized it was coming from the front door, and that's when I got the shivers. I realized Roy wasn't in the house. I got up, turned on the flashlight, and slowly walked to the door. My heart was pounding in my chest. I listened, a quiet, careful scraping, as if someone wasn't scratching, but trying to see if they could open the door. I exhaled and went to the window without opening it. I pointed the flashlight beam there, and I saw it, Roy. He was sitting by the door, rubbing his paw against the wood. But something was wrong. First of all, he never did that. He always barked and whined if he wanted to come in. And secondly, he was standing unnaturally, too straight. The fur on his scruff was tousled, his ears pinned back. His paw moved slowly forward again, running his claws along the door. I looked into his eyes, and I was struck with icy fear, because they weren't his eyes, they were empty, like Roy wasn't behind them. He clawed at the door again, and then I realized something else. His shadow. It was too long. It didn't stretch the way it should in this light. It was like there was something else inside that shadow. Something elongated, too thin. Something that looked at me through my own dog. I stood with my back against the wall, staring out the window. Roy was still banging on the door. No, something that looked like Roy. I suddenly realized I couldn't hear his breathing. No heavy snort, no familiar sound, as he sniffed the air impatiently at the door. Just the silence. I swallowed and slowly reached for my gun. But as soon as I moved, Roy froze, as if he realized what I'd realized. And at that moment, he stood up on his hind legs. I couldn't breathe. His silhouette stretched out. His front paws, now his arms, hung in the air like a man's. But it wasn't a man. Its head twitched slightly to the side as if it were listening. And then, a sudden movement. It turned around and disappeared into the darkness. I could hear its footsteps moving too fast into the woods. Only when it was quiet did I finally take a breath. I stood at the window staring into the void. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Roy was gone. Or what looked like Roy. I don't know how long I stood still, listening to the silence. Perhaps a few minutes. Perhaps an eternity. But I never saw him again. I never found his body. I found no trace of him. Just nothing. I walked the whole lot the next morning. Scoured the woods. Called out for him. But there was no answer. I wanted to believe that he just ran away. That his instinct for self-preservation made him leave when I couldn't see him. But I knew that was a lie. I knew that night was the last time Roy came to see me. Or not Roy. From then on, I never heard a scraping at the door. But every night, when the wind howls in the woods, I think I hear someone's footsteps outside my house. Sometimes I think it's just my imagination. And sometimes I think it's still there. Just waiting. Guys, I heard about a similar case of a girl's dog walking on two legs and behaving very strangely. Here's one of the fragments.
Come on, Dexter.
All right, let's get to the second story. Let's go. The dog who came back. It happened in the fall of 2018 in a small town in Utah. Dan Harper, a 34-year-old mechanic, lived on the outskirts of town with his dog, a large Labrador named Buck. Buck had been his only companion since his divorce, and Dan loved him dearly. One evening, as Dan was fixing his pickup truck in the yard, Buck suddenly froze, raised his ears, and stared toward the woods. In a second, he was out of his seat and running into the darkness. "Buck, get back," Dan shouted. But the dog didn't even turn around. He grabbed the flashlight and ran after him. The forest was thick and cold, and the air smelled damp. Dan called out to the dog, but the answer was silence. He walked through the woods for almost an hour, but Buck was nowhere to be found. Back home, Dan felt anxious, but hoped the dog would return in the morning. But in the morning, Buck was gone, and the next day too. Buck had been missing for 3 days. Dan had already given up hope. When he heard scraping noises at the front door, he rushed to the door and opened it. There sat Buck. Dirty, gaunt, but it was him. "Shit, buddy, where the hell have you been?" Dan knelt down, stroking the dog, but immediately sensed something strange. Buck's fur seemed stiffer than before. His paws were dirty, but that didn't smell like they should after 3 days in the woods. And strangest of all, he wasn't wagging his tail. Before, even if Dan was only away for a couple hours, Buck would greet him happily, jumping up and down and wagging his tail. Now he just stood and watched. Over the next few days, Dan began to notice more and more oddities. Buck moved differently. His gait became more mechanical. Sometimes he would sit staring at the wall and could go for hours without moving. One night, Dan woke up to a strange sound. He opened his eyes and saw Buck standing in the bedroom doorway, just standing there and staring. Buck. The dog didn't move. Only after a few seconds did he slowly turn around and walk away into the darkness. Dan couldn't sleep until morning. The next day, he decided to put a camera in the house, just to see what was going on. Setting it up in the living room, he left Buck in the house and went to work. When he returned, the dog was there, behaving as usual. But when Dan watched the tape, at first everything was normal. Buck just lay there, sometimes getting up and walking around the room. And then, at some point, the dog suddenly froze. His body twitched like a spasm, and then he started to stand up, on his hind legs. He stood up straight. His spine bent at an unnatural angle. His front paws dangled like arms. He stood like that for a few seconds. Then he turned his head straight into the camera. Dan felt goosebumps run down his spine. On camera, the dog began to move, slowly as if studying the space. He took a couple shaky steps on his hind legs and then suddenly jerked and disappeared from the frame. The recording cut off. Dan felt a chill go through his insides. He turned around slowly. Buck was sitting in the corner of the room and watching and smiling. At night, Dan locked the bedroom door. But in the middle of the night, he heard the sound again. Scraping, quiet, slow. And then, Dan. A voice. Hoarse, low, not belonging to a man, but not a dog either. Dan held his breath. "Let me go." He didn't move. Silence. And then there was the creak of the door. He didn't know how, but the lock opened. He felt someone standing by the bed. Out of breath, Dan fumbled for his phone and turned on the flashlight. The light picked out Buck, but it wasn't Buck anymore. The creature that had taken his form stood on 2 paws. Its maw slowly slid open in a smile. Dan screamed. Epilogue. 3 days later, Dan's house was found a mess. Furniture turned over, scratches on the floor and walls. But Dan himself was gone. His car was still there. The doors to the house were locked from the inside. And there was a dog sitting in the corner of the living room. Or rather, what looked like a dog. It just stared at the police officers as they arrived and smiled slowly.